Good morning, or good evening, perhaps I should say, everyone. Some of us are joining from Europe, while others are in a very different part of the world where it's already evening. So that's why I'm taking the caution to say sort of both good morning, good evening, and perhaps good afternoon or even good lunch if you are joining us from other parts of the world. My name is Fredrik Eriksson. I'm the director of the European Centre for International Political Economy, and it's my pleasure today to be hosting and moderating the discussion we're going to have here today about UK trade policy. The title for this webinar is Resetting UK Trade Policy After the Free Trade Agreements. We are partly building this this event on the paper, which was launched by and written by my colleague, David Henig, just a couple of weeks ago, which is called Building a Mature UK Trade Policy. And we're going to put a link to that paper in the chat function. So if you're interested to learn more and hear more, different views about problems, challenges, and opportunities for UK trade policy, you can always click on the link and read what David has to say. It's a great policy brief. So I really urge you all to go and have a look at it. So the context for our webinar and discussion we're going to have today is pretty straightforward. You all know that the UK has been developing an independent trade policy since the time it left the European Union. There's been a focus on signing new bilateral trade agreements, and there's also been a few other more headline-grabbing initiatives, perhaps like applying for membership to the CPTPP. At the same time, there are, however, questions raised about the economic value of these agreements and the extent to which that they can create a lot more trade for the UK, taking into account, of course, that the UK has lost a pretty significant part of trade with Europe after it left the EU. There have been a few contextual developments in trade policy, to put it kindly, which are making it a lot harder for countries to do trade policy these days. And we may be having more difficulty still as the world is gradually moving into different new type of trade policies that are influenced by national security concerns or by climate change policies, or perhaps the general trend of industrial policy and sentiments of economic nationalism that's proliferating in different parts of the world. And the question that we're going to ask is, of course, what this means for UK trade policy. What is it that UK governments should do in order to have a diligent, agile, and forward-looking trade policy that achieves the outcomes that you want to achieve with trade policy? We have 1 hour to go for this conversation. You can always put your questions in the chat function, and we'll see towards the end if it's possible to get some of you to ask questions directly as well. But put your questions in the chat function, and I will make sure to weave it into the conversation that we have. We have 3 speakers joining us this morning or this evening. I am joined by David Henig, who is my colleague at ECIPE, or is the senior fellow and the director of our UK trade policy project. And he is going to start in a minute or so. He's going to be followed by Baroness Dianne Hayter, who is the chair of the Lords International Agreements Select Committee in the House of Lords. She's been in the House of Lords for quite some time and held many other senior positions there as well, including being the shadow deputy leader of the House of Lords. And in her previous roles in politics, she has been General Secretary of the Fabian Society and the Chief Executive of the European Parliamentary Labour Party. Lastly, but not leastly, we have John Ballingall, who is joining us from New Zealand, where he's now a partner or economist at Sense Partners, which is a boutique consultancy in Wellington. He's also had many senior positions in New Zealand's government, including being the Deputy Director of the Economic Division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And perhaps he picked up a few tips or two about trade policy also by being on the board of the Wellington Rugby Referees Association, which of course is a very good starting point if you want to learn the tricks of the trade and trade policy. Without much further ado, I'm going to give the floor to David, who is going to lead us off with a couple of key takeaways from his paper. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Frederick, and good morning, good evening, and thank goodness this hasn't started like my last ECIPE webinar that I was speaking to, when at this point my PC crashed and I was plunged into silence. No, we seem fine this time. So, building a mature UK trade policy, and the irony behind this paper is it didn't start in my mind as a UK paper. It started as trade policy after the free trade agreements, because we're running out of partners, whether actually in the UK, but the EU. There was an article in the New Zealand paper yesterday or the day before about this. We've done many of the most straightforward free trade agreements. Others are hard and wouldn't make a huge difference to numbers. But it's not just about the numbers. The modern challenges of trade are not those that free trade agreements have really been able to solve, in my opinion. So regulatory issues are a good example, where countries have been unwilling to commit that much in treaty, so we're still left with a lot of barriers. If we look at the current trade agenda, carbon pricing, Inflation Reduction Act, subsidies, green measures, I wonder how that fits in with free trade agreements. Well, it doesn't very well. And so you have this gap. Now, thinking about all countries, all policy issues, that just became a little bit unwieldy. So I thought, well, actually, let's give this a UK focus based on my own knowledge and make this a good case study. A country which in effect inherited a global network of free trade agreements, not to play down the efforts of ensuring that they were replicated, but has struggled to know how to develop a trade policy beyond that. Now, about 65% of UK trade is covered by preferential arrangements or unilateral preferences with the least developed countries. And most of the rest is either the US, which isn't very interested in free trade agreements at the moment, or China, Hong Kong and Taiwan, where the politics are very difficult for free trade agreements at the moment. So there's no obvious big play available to the UK from free trade agreements. But the UK has also found that free trade agreements are not necessarily the best fit, because they most help countries, I would argue, in two ways. One, that are having difficulty in tackling their own internal barriers and need the impetus of a free trade agreement to help, or that are major commodity producers wanting to have reduced tariffs, particularly in agriculture. The UK is not really either of those things. We're mostly a services exporter and very much advanced manufacturing product, many of which don't have tariffs anyway. So arguably they've not been a great fit, and our agreements with Australia and New Zealand are not forecast to have any particular economic impact. But there again, and I argue back with myself, free trade agreements are the best brand that trade policy has. None of the other things that we could do are seen by politicians as being so important, such as mutual recognition agreements. And often with good reason. Mutual recognition agreements, I'm told some of them have actually literally no take-up. Some do better, but it's not actually that much. Now, economically, we would probably get more contribution from a new WTO agreement or unilateral tariff reduction, but those are difficult as well. We shouldn't overlook what domestic policy can achieve, because that clearly makes a big impact. But the trade policy professionals do need to be thinking, well, we do need to support politicians who want to seek agreements. And that brings us to another big problem around trade policy at the moment. There's so much to consider. Trade policy covers a wider range of subjects than practically any other policy intervention, perhaps save a budget. Immigration, regulation, environment, labour, many of the huge issues of the day, they are affected by trade. Trade is seen as a way to help tackle issues, to address wider policy challenges, whether that's opening the door to environmentally friendly products and services, or conversely, not allowing the entry of goods made, for example, at the moment, to use current examples, as a result of forced labour or deforestation. Trade enables other policies. It makes statements about other policies. It tells a story, I would argue, of what a country represents. which becomes a big deal, really. It's a big sprawl that comes off the back of trade, so big, in fact, that in the conversations I've been having in the last few days, you sometimes wonder if actually it's difficult for politicians at the moment to know what to do to maintain political interest, to drive through an agenda, when there's no obvious big play and there's lots of small things that could be done. So how then should we think about it? And that was the challenge I came to with the paper. How do we think for the UK? What do we do when faced with these challenges? And I landed on 3 principles I thought would help that anchor the second half of the paper. One is to recognise and embrace the complexities. There has been a view in trade policy, I hear it still, that we need to get back to basics, reject what's often called the trade and agenda, trade and environment, trade and labour. I just don't think we can do that in a democracy. I think we have to respect the many different views of stakeholders, and we have to understand the trade-offs and create a process with societal consent for trade policy. And I think that's very much what happened in New Zealand with their Trade for All strategy, and I hope that John may be able to add more about what they've done, because certainly I look in that direction sometimes with regard to what is best practice. I think it starts with a trade strategy that helps government navigate these different elements. And in the UK, I think we have the advantage that we haven't really used. We have a basic consensus that we're quite open to trade, but we believe that trade must be subject to some conditions. Now, we can argue how open and what the conditions are, but actually, I find that we are generally more open. We could build a useful strategy that follows from this, and we could align it, I think, better with, to name but 3, industrial strategy, regulatory policy and immigration policy. I think the second thing we then have to appreciate is deliverables are by their nature incremental. No single intervention will substantively change our economic performance, but there's rather a lot of things that we need to get right, from the basics of implementing agreements effectively to settling questions for the UK of neighbourhood relations. And what are we going to do about the major global questions such as carbon pricing, subsidies, the future of the WTO? We can influence, but only if I think we get the domestic framework right. Now, how do you drive a government machinery into action when faced with so many issues that could lead to inertia? And I feel that this is where we've missed a trick in not putting in place a regular reporting cycle and targets that helps to drive progress. That an annual report on how our trade agreements are being implemented, given we have so many of them, should then lead to some activity. Right? How do we improve that? How can we, show measurable improvement year on year? It wouldn't be easy to put that in place, but I think that, for example, the EU has been doing a little bit of that. I think it does help. It might sound a little bit like the Blair era government by targets, but I think there was some value in that, in how it can drive a bureaucratic machine. The final principle I was looking at was creating a new open relationship with stakeholders, which might be UK specific because we haven't really done this, but I think it's necessary for all countries in modern trade policy. We've long passed the point where trade talks needed to be carried out in secret because tariff rates were commercially sensitive. We're addressing fundamental questions of balancing different interest groups and policy aims. How we make decisions is as important as what the decisions are. And I think that we've been treating the external negotiation as crucial, whereas actually the modern best practice is that it's finding the internal position that's the more important, and then working with the other party between your respective red lines for what's the maximum you can achieve. And I don't feel that in the UK we've done this very well, and I think that there's a lot of ground we can cover to create, if you like, a Team UK approach. So just a final few words. It's tough times for middle powers such as the UK because the US and the EU are turning away from traditional approaches to trade policy. That was the polite version. I have a slightly less polite version that actually I wrote in a globalization blog on the ECIPE website yesterday. It's actually even tougher for a UK which hasn't really found its feet as an independent player. I think our progress since Brexit has been a little bit disappointing. It's done very well on replicating EU agreements, not so well on kind of finding our own path in terms of how we take trade policy forward. So my hope was that this paper sparked some thinking about how we can do that, and but even more broadly into other countries. Now we're thinking beyond free trade agreements. What is trade policy going to be going forward? So with that, I hand back to Frederick.
All right, thank you so much, David. A lot of good stuff and a lot of food for thought in that, which we're going to return to. But let me first give the floor to Dianne. Over to you, Dianne.
Well, thank you very much. And you can see why the committee that I chair in the House of Lords, the International Agreements Committee, has as its special advisor one David Henig. So most of the stuff we've been able to achieve is down to him. And in a sense, the questions that he poses are exactly the difficult ones that we face. We were set up post-Brexit, or as we led into leaving the European Union, because all our trade had been done by the European Union, and therefore the European Parliament, with its British members, had done the scrutiny on behalf of stakeholders, on behalf of the public, on behalf of electors, and had looked at those agreements and participated in them. And it was thought that when, therefore, we came out and we needed our own trade policy, we needed a committee to do the same sort of thing. The problem was, in typical British way, we hadn't really thought it through. And so we just used existing legislation that had been created at a time when we were in the European Union, had no idea we'd do our own trade. An act that we call CRAG, which is rather a nasty word, but it's it's a piece of legislation that was put through in 2010 to Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, to allow Parliament to look at treaties. But actually, of course, we didn't think there were many treaties coming our way, and it doesn't give any real powers to Parliament. All it says is that once a treaty has been signed, it can't be ratified without the consent of the House of Commons. But basically, they can hold up a treaty, but that's all they can do. And we in the Lords we're allowed to debate it. So we're working with a piece of legislation never created for this. So there is a problem, therefore, of us doing our job, which is to look at treaties and trade policy on behalf of, if you like, Britain, without having the correct tools. But the second element, which I was going to talk about, but David's actually covered it very much, is setting up something really just to look at trade, when actually it is part of our international relations, whether they be the things that David's mentioned, like development or migration or the environment, but issues such as human rights, consumer interests, and even more our security, are actually the environment within which trade has to be placed. David has hinted that we haven't got in the UK a trade policy, and that really, in a way, ought to be part of how the government is seeing a newly, if you like, independent UK within this broader way. And the COVID, by its impact on supply chains, brought into focus that there are issues even beyond tariffs or who we want to trade with, but just our vulnerabilities in the way we do trade, that again we'd rather taken for granted, and has been quite I think a problem not just for us but for the states as well and others, of realizing that we have developed a trade pattern that is actually doesn't have much resilience built into it. So there we are as the committee within Parliament, the only committee in Parliament, because there isn't an equivalent to us in the House of Commons. There is one looking at trade and investment and business and everything, but therefore trade is quite a small part of it. We are the only one looking at it, but actually without the tools to do it. One of the other issues that we've got is, and I'm really interested to know about how New Zealand does this, is where we work as a traditional parliamentary group, that when we want to look at, for example, an agreement, whether it's with India or CPTPP or any of those, we sort of put out a consultation. We say to people, oh, give us your views on what this is looking like. we get people with the stakeholders with a very direct interest coming to us, either the environmentalists who say, you know, this will be very bad over carbon or whatever, or we'll get the animal welfare people saying it's outrageous that we might get stuff from New Zealand or Australia where they're not as nice to their sheep as we are, or we get business saying, look, actually what's really important is whether we can work, you know, without corruption in the enforcement of deals. So we get the people with a very direct interest coming to us as parliamentarians. But there are the silent stakeholders, which are largely the consumer, if you like, the people who don't realize that trade deal has got anything to do with them, who has no one to speak for them when we're looking at this. And the other major group, of course, is future citizens. You know, I happen to be very old. Hopefully, you've got lots of people slightly less old than me on this webinar. But there's a generation yet to be born who will be impacted by the deals we're doing now. And so, and I'll finish on this because I think I've taken my time up. I think the challenge for us as parliamentarians is, yes, to listen and try and scrutinize what a government is doing in terms of the known stakeholders. And that itself is really, really difficult because we don't have the tools, for all sorts of reasons. But even more, how do we listen, particularly to consumers, but also to our future generations, to try and build an international relationship of which trade is a key part, that will be for the long-term good of the country? I don't have any answers to any of those questions, but they're sort of some of the ones that we're wrestling with. I hope I've kept time.
You very much did, Dianne. Thank you so much for your comments. Very good. Also very good questions that you raised at the end. And John, you will have the unenvious position to tell us, both Brits and Europeans here, what on earth are we going to do? Because for some reason, New Zealand has managed to both build sort of a domestic compact on trade issues that have also enabled them to be quite innovative and also to take interesting initiatives in trade policy. So, John, over to you.
Okay, well, many thanks for the invitation to speak this evening. Similar to David, I'm doing a lot of thinking about New Zealand's trade policy strategy in a post-free trade agreement world. And the reason is because New Zealand has been really successful in signing trade agreements. Around 80% of our trade is covered by regional or bilateral trade agreements. And the big ones missing are India and the US. The odds on getting a trade agreement with either of those countries right now, yeah, it's about as good as, about as likely as Wales winning the Rugby World Cup. So, New Zealand is now having to think, well, what do we do next? I will touch on some of the questions that you've raised, Dianne, around engagement and consultation. But I think drawing on New Zealand's experience over the last 15, 20 years, the future of trade policy needs to be considered in light of 4 key questions. What are we trying to achieve with trade policy? Who are we trying to achieve it for? And then I would stop for a minute, because unless you've answered those 2 questions very clearly, any future trade policy strategy is inevitably going to lack direction and a common goal. So I think it's worth spending some time on those things first and foremost, before you start jumping to solutions. Third, how do we bring stakeholders, including the hidden ones, along with us on this journey, particularly if there's going to be a change in direction or flavour of trade policy? And then finally, and intentionally in this order, what is the best way to achieve these goals? And I think there's always a temptation to jump straight to the solutions without adequately identifying the problems. And that ends up wasting resources, missing the consultations phase. I will talk a fair bit about consultation and New Zealand's experience. New Zealand has been very lucky over the last 20, 30 years at least, that trade policy has been very largely a bipartisan issue. When you're living in the last bus stop at the end of the planet and your comparative advantage has tended to be in primary production, which happens to be the areas where most major markets have the highest trade barriers, it's a bit of a no-brainer that we need to be engaged in trade agreements to try and get better access for our primary products. So it really wasn't a political football to any great extent until the Trans-Pacific Partnership came along. And I think there's a lot to be learnt from that. So when the Trans-Pacific Partnership really kicked into gear around 2008 and negotiations were ongoing, suddenly there was a sea change in the public opinion in New Zealand. What once had been bipartisan trade policy and businesses supported it, consumers supported it, most industry bodies supported it. Suddenly there was a bit of an outburst. We had protests in the street in Auckland and Wellington and Christchurch protesting against TPP. And this included a number of opposition politicians such as Jacinda Ardern at the time. It really had shifted. There were a lot of concerns about what was in TPP. Now, a lot of those concerns were about things that weren't really problematic. They were imported narratives through social media that people were just getting upset about, but there were some genuine concerns about sovereignty and investor-state dispute settlement and medicine prices and intellectual property, copyright. Some Maori groups were concerned that US corporations might come in and take their fishing quota, for example. Now, none of these things were ever going to happen in practice, but they generated momentum. And there was enough momentum to put a real dent in New Zealand's bipartisan trade policy. So I think that forced politicians and officials to take a really good look at how they've been positioning trade policy. So this is 10 years ago or so. And they quickly realized that they'd been focused so much on free trade agreements, boosting exports, boosting GDP. They'd kind of forgotten about why we actually do trade policy in the first place. And that's to improve well-being, to improve consumer welfare. Now that might sound a little bit hippie-ish and new age, but it's always been that way since the time of Adam Smith. And it should always be that way. The consumer should always be at the core of trade policy. And I think we forgot that in New Zealand collectively. So the response to this backlash was that a Trade for All advisory board was formed, independently chaired, and it had stakeholders, experts from all across society, including some of the most stringent critics of TPP. They were brought into a room, they were given some funding, and they produced a really detailed report on everything that was wrong with New Zealand's trade policy at that time and how it could be addressed in the future to be more inclusive, more sustainable, and more dynamic and more transparent. That then led to a Trade for All agenda, which is now informing the things we see in our trade agreements, our negotiating mandates, the way things are negotiated, the trade-offs that are made within those trade negotiations, how the results of trade agreements are communicated, how they're evaluated before being taken to Parliament. And it's created a very different approach to trade policy in New Zealand. A much broader range of stakeholder views are taken into account. I think we've moved beyond the traditional consultation process that Dianne, you mentioned, which was, we want to do an FTA, tell us what you'd like to see in it. and you get exporters telling you things and the occasional import body saying, yeah, we're keen. We're now moving into much more of a co-design type process where stakeholders are engaged from the bottom up. Not all of them can have all of their wants all of the time. That's never going to work, but they are actively listened to. And I think the approach to trade policy now is much more of a partnership than it has been in the past, where businesses would say something, some officials would listen, do their best, report back at the end. It's a very different process. It's a more time intensive and labor intensive process, a lot more outreach, a lot more of officials getting out from the comforts of their own homes and offices, getting out around the country, speaking to businesses, speaking to Māori groups, speaking to Pacific people groups, speaking to youths, speaking to non-government organizations, those interested in climate change. It takes quite a different set of skills to sitting in a dingy negotiating room at 5 a.m, arguing about commas and rules of origin. So it's been quite a big challenge, I think, for our trade policy officials. They've had to get out there, engage, actively listen, not overpromise, and then make sure they got back to them afterwards as well, so it wasn't tokenistic. So look, I'll stop there. We can talk a bit more about what I think New Zealand should be doing in the future in the questions, if you like. But since there seems to be a bit of interest in the way New Zealand now approaches trade policy, perhaps I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much, John. And let's indeed come back to some of the issues that you raise, which are, I mean, they're not specific to New Zealand. I mean, I think basically everything you talked about, I think, are high relevance to not just the UK, but any country, or indeed even the EU, that approaches these issues today. But let me start a little bit more on sort of using the experience of New Zealand and figuring out whether this is an approach which is necessary for the UK and the extent to which it would bring sort of a different quality to how the UK pursues its trade policy domestically, both in terms of anchoring its objectives and defining, of course, what the consequences are going to be in terms of who we're going to negotiate with, over what, and what are the trade-offs that we need to be aware of. So, David, back to you. To what extent is sort of the frustrations one can have about UK trade policy today, to what extent is it a reflection of a process and a political institutional environment which hasn't been helpful to address these type of issues, and finding sort of a balanced approach which is going to sort of listens to relevant stakeholders, including the ones that are usually not heard when you are defining trade policy? It seems to me that I mean, the UK debate, of course, has been excessively influenced by some of the politics that led up to Brexit, and of course the politics after Brexit as well. You know, and having an independent trade policy was for some Brexiteers quite big of a selling point, and they made statements and perhaps promises which were a bit on the wild side, to put it kindly. And sort of anyone who's had any experience with trade policy could have said right away, I mean, you know, in your dreams, that's never going to happen. But it seems to me that we have this gap between, on the one hand, the broad political orientation about the UK and what it stands for, and on the other hand, sort of its incapabilities of trying to formulate something which is reflective of where sort of the broader consensus in the country seem to lie, at least in my view. So how do you think, David? I mean, what's the sort of the experiences from New Zealand? Is there something of relevance for the UK here?
Yes. I mean, let me take an example of something that's not often given, because it's something that worked quite well in the UK, and that's trade remedies. Now, Yeah, trade remedies is no different to trade agreements. We inherited lots of cases from the EU. In effect, had to decide which ones to keep, which ones to not keep, and set up an institutional structure. And both within government and now within a body called the Trade Remedies Authority, I would argue we've done a pretty good job of it. Stakeholders generally seem happy. They seem involved. There seems to have been a process that worked. There seems to have been a process there that was markedly different to one that, for example, went through most of the negotiations with the EU or with other countries. And you could argue that it being trade remedies, it being lower profile, officials were perhaps able to learn lessons from the likes of New Zealand and just do those things without the sort of political fights that were going on elsewhere. All of which is to say that officials in the mainstream, faced with these wild promises, but also faced with a government that from Theresa May onwards really didn't believe in the things that John was talking about from New Zealand, didn't believe in that kind of openness in general, either for Theresa May's reason, because that's how she was as a person and a prime minister, or because they feared that the Remainers or whatever were out to get it. It was very difficult to do. So if you like, that's by way of proof we could do. I think we can do this. We just haven't been able to, and there have been reasons, and they haven't necessarily been trade policy reasons why we got caught up in all of this. I think the second case study is Australia versus New Zealand trade agreements. We hear a lot of controversy in the UK about Australia trade agreement and none whatsoever about the New Zealand one. Now, partly New Zealand's increase in agricultural quota is less dramatic because New Zealand already had a generous quota dating back to 1973 for sheep, and one of the reasons Australia was so keen on an agreement was to catch up with New Zealand's market access. But also, New Zealand not only are quite good at engaging with stakeholders in their own country, but every time they came into the UK, their negotiators also caught up with various UK stakeholders, including farming groups, including myself, various others. As far as I could tell, the Australians didn't do that. They just wanted the deal. So the net effect for Australia becomes an issue, a controversy. New Zealand, not really a controversial deal. All of which is to say that then I think we can, and I think we can learn the lessons from that actually the consultation process does work. And it will work if we have trade deals going forward. Now, there's a question, of course, will we have those trade deals? But I take another example, India, which is a difficult trade partner, always is. It may well be that we have to choose between not much of a deal and no deal, the ambitious deal being impossible because of India. If the government sets that up right with stakeholders, you will be able to find a lot of stakeholders saying, actually, that's okay, we can live with that, it's a step forward. Whereas I think if it comes as a surprise that that's the choice, I think government will find it harder. So actually, I think that the news, what we can learn from New Zealand is that actually there's a way of making tough decisions a little bit easier and making them more acceptable from doing it. So that's the lesson I take, and I think there's no reason that can't work in a UK context, especially once the fog of war, so to speak, around Brexit is now calming down. I think we can go back to normal, and I see no reason we can't do this kind of open policy making. We just got a bit lost for a few years.
Dianne, over to you as well on the same issue, basically the lessons from New Zealand, and how do you think they could be useful in a British context? And let me also tag along another question to that one, which is, it seems to me that New Zealand for a long while has had a pretty strong economic strategy, which has been buffering up its trade policy. As John laid out, I mean, if you've been traditionally a strong exporter or a strong producer in primary goods, you've been confronted with high barriers to trade in virtually every part of the world. So it's been an obvious case for you that you needed to have an economic strategy, and you needed to reach out to other parts of the world and see what you could do in terms of negotiating reductions in market barriers. And of course, in return for that, you need to offer market access and perhaps some better rules for accessing the New Zealand market. But economic strategy seems to me to be sort of a pretty important part of having a trade policy which is going to be successful. That doesn't mean sort of downplaying other type of issues or concerns. It just means sort of that if you don't have a sort of a government orientation which is given a lot of focus on trying to drive economic growth, it's just going to be very difficult to find a political compact or a political support for an agreement in a country, because there's always going to be different sort of trade-offs. There will be winners and losers. And now, since we're talking about trade agreements that sort of on the margin may not be as significant as trade agreements been in the past, sort of that political balancing act also becomes a bit more difficult. So if you could also comment a bit on that, sort of the role of economic strategy and what that entails for UK now.
Thank you. I mean, the first thing I want to say is always slightly sensitive to our Kiwi friends, and I'm sorry, but I'm speaking to you from London, where we've got nearly 10 million population in London. New Zealand is 5.1 million population. So we have to be very careful not to think what suits a country of 5 million. Our working population, I think, is now 30 million. Our population is 62 million or something. So even, you know, if Labour wins the election tomorrow and I become trade minister, I'm not going to be able to do the sort of consultation and work that is possible in New Zealand. We're talking about, you know, a very much larger and complex country to do that on behalf. So I just think we have to be also, I mean, it's always very, because I just adore New Zealand. I spent time there. I just love it. And I always think, why can't we do what they do? So, but there's a bit of me that knocks in and says, well, yeah, it would be easier if we had their population and also their degree of consensus as well. We are at the moment a very, very divided country. We're not in the same position as America, which is, you know, I think as divided as it's been in my lifetime. But we are a pretty divided one. And over this particular area, Brexit is still a big divide here. So we've got all our problems of a UK governance system anyway. We are born with a system of high degree of secrecy. We don't have that lovely openness of many other countries. And it's all actually better in Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, than the rest. Our civil service is imbued with a sort of belief in secrecy. We also are imbued with a silo. I mean, I'm always impressed when I've been to New Zealand and gone into the beehive, where all the ministers have their offices in the same place in the beehive. And as you come out of their doors, you actually meet the other ministers. Our ministers are physically located along Whitehall and further afield in their own departments. So they very much are head of a department rather than a group of the cabinet that absolutely see themselves as the political drivers of a country. Now, again, we're not New Zealand. I'm not suggesting we can necessarily follow that model, but there are, I think, strengths in what New Zealand is able to do that enables a much more cross-department way. I mean, again, if we were the same and our trade minister came out, they want to go and have a cup of coffee, and they ran into the foreign secretary or they ran into the minister of labour, you're much more likely to have the word about, well, we've been looking at this, you know, and that, and it happens. It's, you know, our system. So we've got a lot of things separate from trade that make it harder to move to that cross-department approach that I would love to see, but you know, I'm just trying to be realistic about it. And the other issues then are the Brexit one. I was the shadow minister for Brexit all the way through and did all the withdrawal agreement and all of that. And, you know, if I said it once in the House of Parliament, I said it umpteen times, there is no such thing as sovereignty when you come to trade. because if you're going to trade with America, which was the one at the time everyone said we're going to trade with, you'll follow their regulations for the size of widgets, or how cold meat has to be when you start sending it across the countries, or whatever. That actually, if you want to do trade, there is no independent regulation, and yet we left the EU and bought into a mentality that said you could be sovereign and overtrade. That really isn't possible. So we have got ourselves starting a discussion on future trade from a really, really bad position, that we have a silo system, we have a secrecy system, and then we also have some sort of mentality that we can be sovereign over all sorts of things and yet still trade with whoever. So, and then the other bit, when John mentioned about what had happened to TPP, one of the issues there was about how do you deal with trade disputes with ISDS. And actually, we've got ourselves in a really funny position, because our Tory government said we don't like the European Court of Justice. Now, the European Court of Justice was many things, but one of the things was that it was very open and there was a clear public interest in it. Now, moving out of that, we don't seem to have a system, because the WTO isn't working very well, but also we haven't thought about how do you enforce trade agreements which have a public interest dimension to them and which have a transparency interest to them. Now, maybe ISDS wasn't the right way around, and I understand why that all happened, coming from the NGO background myself. But actually, maybe all of us around the world who are interested in more trade need to think of what is the equivalent that will be open and transparent and have a public interest bit of it. So I would love us to be able to just follow the New Zealand path, but I just am being realistic about it. And some of that goes into your second question, Frederick, which is to what extent you can, discuss trade or anything without it being part and parcel and of an economic strategy. But again, it goes wider than that. It is, as I think David Henig said at the beginning, it's part of your migration views as well, about how open you want to be. Because at the moment, we have an economy that needs more people working in it. So there we are with, a government saying it wanted to reduce migration, but an economic strategy that says, actually, we just don't have enough workers at the moment. We've got to bring them in. And also, we don't have an education strategy. So we are bringing in not just people to work in our social care area, but we're bringing in highly educated and trained people, because we haven't had an education strategy to develop that. So yes, trade has to be part of an economic strategy, but that has to be in a very broad context, which again, partly because we're silo, we've not been very good at doing. And maybe, John, in New Zealand, you have made your training, your apprenticeship, your bursaries, everything you do about training the next generation is much more part of your economic strategy than, unfortunately, it's been of ours. You have to understand, I'm not actually sure you used the word when you introduced me, Frederick, but I am a Labour politician, just in case anyone listening isn't picking up that I am rather biased on these issues, and a different British politician would obviously give you a rather different take on this.
Thank you so much, Dianne. John, over to you. I mean, you've heard a couple of, have two opposing opinions here, I think, on the usefulness of the New Zealand experience and what it can do for the UK. So I'll let you comment a bit on that. But I also want to ask you another question, which of course connects with some of the things that you were talking about in your introductory remarks, which is New Zealand may have been fundamentally a primary goods exporter. It remains an important sector, but it was sort of fundamentally oriented towards that sector 30 years ago. But as its economy has changed, and as broad economic modernization and structural change has happened. New Zealand's economy today, of course, is much more complex and sophisticated, and includes a lot of outward orientation also in other sectors. And it seems to me that New Zealand has been quite fast and quite innovative, at least in comparison with other parts of the world, in thinking about, so how do we get into other type of issues? How do we find a way to connect trade policy to the main streams of international trade today, which of course is going to be in services and especially in the digital services field. So if you also can say a few words there, because I want to take this also to David and Dianne later, because when we think about trade policy, and the numbers that we've been discussing now on how much of trade that is covered by trade agreements, we usually talk about goods, but we are increasingly services-oriented economies, and the future of trade, of course, is going to be highly dominated by the way that technological change brings new opportunities to trade.
Sure, no, good questions. And first of all, it may seem on the other side of the world that this has been a smooth process for New Zealand, that everyone's just agreed, we all love trade policy. We wake up in the morning and when we're having our porridge, our kiwi fruit, we have a polite chat about trade policy over the breakfast table. It's actually been far more challenging than that. As I say, that the post-TPP challenge to the social license to conduct trade negotiations was material. You know, there were some significant legal issues raised around the Treaty of Waitangi and other issues. It's been a prolonged effort over many, many years since then to try and get things back on an even keel. And it's taken a huge amount of resources, patience, explanation. And I fully take your point, Dianne, that it's a lot easier to have interagency discussions in Wellington when the ministries are literally 2 minutes apart and everyone knows everyone. So it is certainly, the transaction costs of doing that here are much lower. So fully take your point. And I also don't want to suggest that going into trade negotiations with quite a different mandate that takes into account everyone's preferences and views is easy. It doesn't. It sets up a different set of trade-offs. And for New Zealand, that doesn't have a lot to offer in trade negotiations other than we're nice and a bit creative and don't be nasty to us. We're now going out and having to ask for more things about Indigenous people's economic development, around perhaps gender issues or Paris Agreement climate change issues, where domestic stakeholders have said to us, you need to do much better on these things. That's fine, but we can't, it's pretty hard for New Zealand to get all of those things and get better market access and services liberalisation and investment conditions. So it changes the dynamics of those negotiations a bit. So it is more difficult. In terms of your second question there, Frederick, about innovation and moving the thought process away from goods, I think that's been underway for a while now. And what you're seeing is innovation, which is born out of necessity, really, for New Zealand. We don't have economic size. We don't have geopolitical clout, really, as much as we love the cliche of punching above our weight. We have to be realistic. If we want to have a say on some of these novel emerging trade issues, we need to be at the table when they first start being discussed. And that's why we've launched or been at the table to discuss things like the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, Indigenous Peoples Agreements. Now, exactly what these are going to look like and where they're going to end up and how much difference they're going to make, it's really hard to know. But New Zealand has to innovate and try and be at the table to start having those discussions, start shaping the rules and norms around these new issues, and hope like hell that some of the bigger guys come on board, as Korea has done with the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, to try and give them more bulk. And hopefully if we get more and more people in, then that means we're well positioned. So I think there's a huge role for innovation and for medium and smaller powers to come together with like-minded countries. That's the big thing. These are countries who want to make progress on these issues. So you're not battling against traditional arguments so much, because everyone's generally got the same end point in mind, or at least they all want to discuss the same issues. So perhaps that's something that the UK could think about.
Thank you, John. We are getting close to the end now. So over to David and Dianne for, I think, is going to be our final comments. But David, can the UK be an agile, innovative, frontier-oriented type of middle-sized power? It seems to me, I mean, Dianne pointed to the complexities of, on the one hand, being a large economy with a sizable population. It's not like in New Zealand. On the other hand, it must also have dawned on the UK that if it leaves the EU, it needs to find another niche if it wants to have a voice in global developments. And that could, for instance, also include, as questions that we've received in the chat here, that it could start to define itself in a slightly different way compared to the EU on issues like trade and environment, not necessarily becoming unilateral in that sense, but trying to find sort of what are the necessary balancing acts that will need to happen between two competing objectives that, well, at least sometimes they're going to be in competition with each other. But sort of choosing a strategy for the UK where it wants to be at the frontier and lead globally on these issues rather than being reactive.
Three thoughts, really. I think on services, I just don't think anybody's quite got this yet. And I think it would be helpful to admit that. Well, okay, what we've done in our free trade agreements, what everybody's done in their free trade agreements hasn't worked that well. We need to try to find a different way, or a new way, or a better way to do this. And I'd long wondered, can we have a sort of a more permissive approach with allies to services? Say, look, if you're providing services in New Zealand, you're providing services in the UK, then you can do it with each other with no barriers. Is that kind of thing, almost taking inspiration from the single market, the EU, is that possible? Or is the UK too big in services? Is it because it's a services superpower, as has been claimed, that nobody would do business with us? Not sure, but I think we need to develop that thinking further. And that brings me on to the second point, which is, for me, the big advantage of CPTPP membership to the UK is not economic, nor is it really about the future of that agreement, because I don't think that it will change very much. I think it is that opportunity to spend more time talking with New Zealand, Singapore, Japan, Chile, and saying, okay, what can we do in these areas? What can we do to go to take things forward? I think the digital agreements, they still feel a little tentative. They still have major sort of statements saying we'll do this unless we have a good policy reason not to. And in the end, so I feel there's further we can go on that. And I think that brings me to the final point I want to make, which is this concept of the UK leading. No, I don't see the UK as a leader, because I think I'll take Diane's point on that. Actually, we're not quite as small as New Zealand, who can lead in that way. But what I think we can be is, I think we should be, is to work well with other countries to improve on that in that way, add some heft to those debates. I think I'd see us more in that category of taking the leadership role that perhaps New Zealand can keep that, but if New Zealand can kind of help us then to follow them and be a major power that sort of takes what New Zealand and other smaller countries are doing and allows us to move forward. Sorry, I've taken up time that Dianne, and she needs to leave very soon, so apologies, Dianne, but hope you've got a minute or two.
Over to you, Dianne.
I am going to have to leave as soon as I've said this, which is really awful, and I apologise. It is quite important for this, because we're about to meet the Secretary of State for Trade, So it is quite important. I mean, I think I just want to say that actually what David's just said about, and I think John, you used the word like-minded. You know, we are facing a world that I didn't expect of my generation that we would be facing as I was growing up, which is we have got now, you know, we've got Russia and we've got China as major global and destabilizing powers, partly on trade, actually, although in the case of Russia, of course, it's a much different and a much worse assault on our assumptions about freedom, about rule of law, about respect for treaties. But therefore, the importance of like-minded nations working together is more important now, perhaps, than it was it's really since 45. There are two phrases that we use a lot in this country. One is that families who eat together stay together. And that is obviously often said about trade. The more you trade, the less you fight. And the other issue is Churchill's, George is better than war. I didn't think we would need these again, but I just see that we have to work with like-minded people and therefore see trade both as an economic driver, but actually as entrenching, if you like, all our beliefs in rule of law, in freedom, in redistribution, in common humanity. I'm really sorry to leave. It's a horrid and inappropriate movement to leave out, but I hope you'll accept that I now have to run. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dianne. We are also coming to a close with this webinar. And I think it's been a very, very useful discussion, laying out a couple of issues and concerns, which are very important. I think it's not just sort of families that eat together, stay together, it's also people that discuss together, stay together. And I think that's very useful platform that we can offer, that have this thought process, which is in many ways a very much of a joint thought process, because I think most Western economies are confronting exactly the same issues that we've been discussing here today. So thank you so very much for joining me, and also thanks very much to John, Dianne, and David for speaking and sharing very thoughtful comments about the future of trade policy. This, of course, is an issue that we're going to return to many times in the future, and I hope you all will be interested to join us then as well. So thanks so much for joining us this morning or this evening, and if I don't see you any time before, I hope you're going to have a very happy summer, because Europe is moving into the summer season now, and of course that means we are all much more cheerful than we usually are. So thank you very much.
Thank you.